Welcome to Other Lands Editing Podcast, where two speculative fiction writers and editors help you craft fantastical worlds by keeping an eye on exacting editing and foundational writing principles. Every 2 weeks, we bring you interviews with other writers, advice on editing and writers' craft pitfalls, and reviews of popular media to help you grow. So sit back, relax, and join Margaret Bates and Midnight Boss as we discuss all things writing and editing. Hi, everybody. Welcome to week 3 of our podcast. Today, we're going to be talking more about what types of editing there are and how you work with an editor and going from there, because we get a lot of questions about even what to expect with that relationship and what to expect out of your editor's services. So to start, I think we could break down the big types of editing because I think people get confused about what's a beta reader, what's an alpha reader, what's developmental, all that kind of stuff. So you do a lot of the developmental, which I always think of as the hardest, like more in-depth type of editing. So sort of start big picture and move down to smaller scale stuff. Do you want to talk about developmental edits, Midnight?
Maybe. I like the developmental edit you'll probably notice as you're looking at editors' websites is going to be the big ticket item. It's the one that takes the longest. It's the one that is most comprehensive in looking at elements other than grammar. So if you are towards the beginning of developing the editing, you may be not fully determined on certain plot points or you're concerned about character or like whether your world building is coming across, that's where you are going to the developmental editor because you're still in the process of solidifying all the parts of what you're working on. So your developmental editor will go through the entire document, but they're probably going to, instead of giving you line by line information, they will probably track things as they go through and then give you broad advice on characterization, world building, plot, consistency, among other things. Are there any other things that you tend to look at when you're looking at developmental
Yeah,
edit?
I do developmental editing as well. And with me, one note before I forget, but it's not, it is the earlier stage of editing for sure, but it doesn't mean you finish your first draft and you send it to the developmental editor. You still need to have done self edits so that your manuscript is as good as you think it can be at this stage, is polished. So it makes it easier for the developmental editor to really focus on the big picture and do their job. It's really hard as a developmental editor to get a manuscript that you can tell is maybe only in first or second draft overall, and it's got a lot of typos or just things where the author clearly changed their idea midstream and didn't go back and fix it, because that means that we can't focus our minds on what we need to do to help you the most. So just as a note, that when you work with developmental editors, make sure that you know the scale of what we do and that we help you better when you have it as prepped as you can. But for me, I think plot, character, like if I see like plot holes, I'll point those out a lot because sometimes people have those. I also think with character, it's more, are they annoying? Are they coming across the way the author thinks they're coming across? But the other thing for me that I keep going back to often, the goals and motivations of the characters. I think maybe in a way because I come at it from more of a psychologist background and psychology angle, but I often will ask people both in my comments on the manuscript and often in my final developmental edit letter. I usually send about 5 to 6 pages of notes at the end of this is what I see as your big issues. But I often focus on, I didn't understand what the heroine's main goal was for the book, or since I do a lot of romance editing, I understand this is the hero's goal as far as the romance is going, but what are his other goals as a character? What is he trying to achieve, and what is going to make him a more rounded character by the end outside of the romance? Because one thing I see, especially in newer romance authors, is they focus all on the romantic arc, but they forget to give their characters other personalities and other goals and things that they're working towards, usually with the external conflict.
Yeah, and that's what another thing that will determine the difference between the developmental edit and the line edit and the copy edit is that long document at the end where you're going through multiple points. So like the deliverable is different, where you will have probably on the line edit, the copy edit, and the proofreading. something with track changes or you're marking on a PDF, the developmental edit will have minimal changes within the document itself, but then a longer letter where you're addressing these bigger picture issues.
I will say with a developmental edit, I don't make track changes is basically the Word version of red penning things. It's a function
Yeah.
in review where you mark it up as if you were writing over like corrections by hand. I'll make comments, like I'll actually have the comments function on and leave questions chapter by chapter, but it's really all building up to that long note at the end where I'm trying to explain this is where I see things have, had issues. Have you tried X, Y, or Z? But it takes so long to read something in depth like that and then help make up plans or look at the macro characterization, plotting, consistency, weird plot holes, and write a letter that really addresses those ideas than any other type of editing. It's also why it usually costs the most.
Yeah. Well, because of time. But
Yeah, it's
also
a time
expertise,
commitment.
I would say, is that you want to find the best developmental editor for you, and that often means finding the person who's going to be the best at getting you where you need to be with writing those things. It's a particular set of skills that are separate from just being able to do the grammar. Um,
Yeah, for sure. And then I guess that leads to line edits. So what if you've gotten someone to do the dev editing and it's, fix the characterization issues, etc. The next step is usually the line editing, correct?
yeah. So I think it's important to note here that we have the terms line editing and copy editing, and they get used almost interchangeably. Possibly because a lot of editors will just do both at once.
We do,
And,
basically.
this is one thing where the line edit, technically speaking, is where you're looking at the flow of the document, the style, making note on any clunky sentences or things that are need to sound or read better, but not trying to lose the voice of what's going on. You don't want to take away the author's voice while you're doing that. So if we consider the line edit a little bit more of the style edit, then the copy edit is looking through specifically for grammar and mechanics and getting all of those out of the way. Perhaps the reason they get collapsed is that when you're looking at a freelance editor, people want things more cheaply, but also they may be sending an earlier draft than they need to. So there does need to be some look at grammar and mechanics before they can get to this flow, which is
Kind of
a
agree,
problem,
because
but
like
it is.
if the flow is sometimes really clunky or really hard to read through a sentence, or it's just got clauses that don't make sense, often it's also because some of the grammar rules are getting violated. So they kind of, especially in I feel like indie editing sphere, get mixed up a little bit together because a lot of times fixing sentence flow comes from sorting out the grammar. I do
Yeah,
that
I
a
think
lot.
that in a more professional sense, they would expect before they even went into the developmental edit that they had already taken care of the major grammar problems. So when they go into dev editing, they deal with bigger picture. They go into line editing, they improve the flow, and copy edit should be like not even a deep edit for grammar and mechanics. It would be like fixing things that had gotten disrupted or weren't fully clear yet.
And like to be a grammar nerd about it, just in this particular instance, for example, I'll see a lot of what they call dangling modifiers. Something like, I'm trying to think, like walking into the store, uh, the hardware store's only open on Saturdays. Something weird where they are trying to describe one thing, but they're not thinking or they didn't reread the sentence and it ends up describing like not, the protagonist or like an active character, but like the object they're going towards, like the store. Just weird things like that where it doesn't make sense. You have to reread it and go, okay, I get why the flow is off, but also the grammar's been violated. So now I've got to fix both at once.
Yeah. So I like to use the one of like recently grown in the lab. The president congratulated the scientists. Where, if you think about it, why do you think that the president was grown in a lab? And sometimes it feels like an academic exercise to say, well, the introductory modifier has to modify the subject because it's the closest noun. But when you read it, it sounds dumb as it sounds like clearly this is not something that really happened. And so
Or
sometimes
was it?
or was it? Maybe he
Lab
was thrown in
precedent.
a lab.
Yeah.
If you're in sci-fi and fantasy, maybe it's true, but that's not how you would deliver that information. So, fixing the order of the clauses, fixing the placement of the modifiers, it helps the reader a lot to follow you as what you're describing. And when you're in your head creating the thickest description and the most beautiful prose, like sometimes that will fall away because you're focusing on something else. So
Yeah.
sometimes it's because you don't know the rules, and sometimes it's because you can only do so many multitasking things in your brain at once.
Yeah, or sometimes like I'll get some books where people kind of got in their own head or they ended up developing a rhythm for their sentences and didn't realize it. And I see that often in first person where they'll do the participial phrases or the adjectival phrases like that and being like running towards the fight. I leapt into action, but then the next sentence will be like pulling out my weapon, I leapt towards the bad guy, like whatever. So all of a sudden, everything starts with ing to describe the character. Basically, when we say modifiers or participial phrases like that. Driving by the store, I pulled over to get some bagels, but then they keep doing it. So that does become more of a line issue because it becomes this sing-songy pattern. But then half the time, they're not necessarily always applying how those phrases are supposed to work either. And so I'm getting confusion from like the modifier isn't actually modifying the noun it's supposed to. So that's kind of why I think, especially in indie book editing, the copy and the line edits get compressed together more. But the line
Yeah.
is for the flow of the sentences while preserving voice, and the copy editing is for the grammar issues. But the one thing you can't combine, or I don't believe you should, is
Yeah.
consolidating the dev edits and the line edits. Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that this is something that people will offer a lot because the client asks for it. Is that they know that they have some grammatical issues, but then they also want to get the dev edit done, but also they don't want to pay for both of those. And I understand being cheap because this is a business that you are investing in before knowing that you're ever going to see a payoff. But the reality is, this is what we used to say in the writing center. You're not going to sew up someone's finger if you're going to cut off their arm. And how that applies to the line edit and grammar is that the dev edit, if done correctly, you should be doing substantial revision, probably. If you're not just going to say, okay, well, Margaret told me that my character needed more motivation. So you added a line about them loving their cat and then move on. Of like, it should be more substantial. So you're going to be changing a lot of things. So it doesn't necessarily make sense to do like a full line or copy edit when so much is going to be in flux. It means that basically you paid for a line and dev edit, and then you're going to have to go back and get another line and copy edit. And I feel like it's kind of a scam, is that they know you want that, but then they give it to you, and then you still have to invest more in on the other end of it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I'm not casting aspersions necessarily on other editors. I just know it's not something
Yeah.
I would do or I would feel comfortable doing. And I know sometimes people find things as like authors, systems that work for them. So if that works for you and you make that choice, that's great because you've made that choice. But I am, as someone in the business, giving you my insight to it and saying that if the developmental edit is really good and thorough, you should be making usually big structural changes. I'm not saying you're changing your entire book, but sometimes I'll read a book and the bad guy or the antagonist just doesn't work. And I'll be like, I need you to have more of this on the page than just in the final fight scene. You need to build him up over time. So if you do that, you're going to be going back and adding in scenes of the, antagonist all the way along. But if you do that and really make those changes, you're going to have different scenes or maybe whole chapters that haven't been line edited because you just added them due to the developmental request. So then it doesn't make sense because now you kind of have a book that maybe a few chapters or some were good so you could preserve them and just make the line edits, then maybe you have whole new sections that, like you said, are going to get line edits anyway.
And let's add on to this because I kind of didn't really go into it, is that the dev editor again needs to be focusing on that big picture. So if they're going through every line and correcting your tenses at the same time that they're looking for the big picture, they're not giving you the full dev edit treatment. You're just not getting what you're paying for. So it comes to a matter of focus of what the editor needs to be working on at that moment. Now, a lot of us can go through very easily and just edit small things as we go, but at the same time, you know that they have to go back and rethink about what they're doing. It's just the focus isn't where it needs to be.
And that's true when I get a clunkier manuscript that I can tell hasn't been read through as much. Like it takes a lot, and again, I think it's why it gets charged the most. It takes a lot of brain power. It takes a lot of a specific way of thinking, and it takes a lot of time to developmentally edit something. So if I'm being distracted trying to correct your line edits or copy edits or both, then you're right. I'm not giving you the full mind share, the full effort towards really going, is this character working? Did she make sense in this scene? Am I feeling like the mother character is too overbearing? That kind of bigger picture thing.
Yeah.
So what's a proofread?
Proofread would be the last step, the last stop on the line before you put it out before your paying readers. So this would be the things where you have the last minute typos. You meant the, but you spelled it TH. Some maybe sometimes punctuation that didn't get in there, like an ending quotation or something. So proofreading really should be like a skim through for the minor errors at the very end.
It's kind of like if you're a human, you went to that fancy party and you're right there and you're about to go in and you're got your dress on and your makeup and you look great. And then your friend politely says you've got a little bit of spinach in your teeth and like you get that one last thing sorted. It's like that. This
Yes.
book should be as close to pristine as possible. But then your proofreader goes and says, oh, well, you missed the its versus its and you made it possessive instead of just a contraction, just those kind of things. Or like someone's like, oh, you misspelled the wrong there. It should be really like that last minute, oh, we need to just adjust your bow tie or like get that one little bit of wrinkle out of your perfect shirt kind of thing.
Think also for the sci-fi and fantasy, you're probably going to have, or maybe even the romances, like the consistency of names, is that occasionally, like when you get to that last stage, maybe spell check changed Brian's name to the normal spelling and it's supposed to have a Y instead of an I. And you're like, okay, well, this needs to definitely be consistent throughout the entire document. So the proofreader will catch that and say, okay,
Yeah, I think that happens like in romances because sometimes they're spelling especially the heroes' names in like funny way. Like this Jackson with an X has really caught on over the last decade because I guess it's like tough bikery guy. But it might have defaulted it back to Jackson, the spell the Jackson. You're right with fantasy sci-fi, those names are gonna be intense and spell check's gonna be not happy. So
yeah,
the
you should
extra
probably just
I.
add those to your dictionary for whatever program you're using so that
Yeah,
it
for
will.
sure. Okay, so those are the big types of editing you'd pay an editor for. What about, I've heard all the things about alpha and beta readers. What are those? And are they the same thing?
I mean, technically, no, they're not the same thing. I wouldn't know where to start with this. I feel like people will go to the rate beta readers before anyone else, as they're like your first readers before you're going to a major editor. Um,
Yeah, like I feel the term beta reader started more well, the first place I ever saw it was fan fiction. So you'd have someone who's a friend who after you drafted a chapter or a whole book would say, okay, I'll volunteer to read this for you and give feedback. And I think that they do have that now as a parlance, especially in original fiction, where you might have a friend or someone from a critique group, someone you trust, who after you've got the manuscript done, but you know it's not ready for developmental edit, you don't want to spend the money yet, but maybe you want to swap it with a friend who's a fellow writer and say, I just want to see
yeah,
where things aren't quite right. I know something's not gelling yet. What is it? And that is where I think about that. And usually it is like they're friends who are writers. There's someone you know from your writers group or your social media of choices, Tumblr, and you swap services because you're both together in that mindset. I don't think like if I had a retired parent and, my dad had said, been an English teacher instead of a lawyer, and I'd go to my dad and be like, hey, can you read this? I know you super love paranormal romance. For context, my dad is the kind of old dude who reads a million books about like World War II. It's not the audience. Like sometimes people I think feel if I want to have a beta reader, it should be my best friend or like my mom. And if they're not someone who's already into reading books or someone who already kind of thinks about writing or is a writer, then that might not be a good idea. If I took it to a beta reader who's a friend of mine, happen to be a book blogger, and so they review books a lot, or a book TikToker, like that might make sense. But if someone who's not really a reader to begin with, but just someone you know because they're your friend, I wouldn't recommend doing it that way.
I'd also kind of advise you not to have your regular readers to be your beta readers. I've seen people do that where they will get people who are already on their mailing list to be their beta readers. You want them to be your ARC readers, actually. Like you, that's a different thing, but the people who have the advanced reading copy, you want them to have the close to polished version so they can go out and talk about it because they're part of PR instead of using them for that early developmental stage.
I also have feelings about that some kind of way because I'm a big fan of people who do labor should get paid for it. I totally understand if you're two authors who do a swap with each other or critique group of finished manuscripts and they're kind of your beta readers, then at least you're giving each other value back and forth. Or if you look, there are a lot of places on either um, websites who are do author services sites or on Facebook groups for authors where people will recommend or like promote their own beta reading services. And since it's a smaller scale type of review than a developmental edit, it's much cheaper. But I don't believe in just like using fan labor for sustaining your business because it makes people who are your fans and readers frustrated with you eventually because of the pressure. And I just feel like it's in poor taste. I'll just be honest about it.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm a big proponent of not taking emotional labor from people. But you're going to say, okay, if I hired, say, Margaret, because I do beta reads, for a beta read, what do I get? I am going to read the whole book. I am going to read it, but I won't take the inline comments the way I would with a developmental edit. And I will write you a letter at the end. But instead of being, 5, 6, 7 pages, it's really in depth. It'll be 1 to 2 of the biggest glaring plot character issues I see, or the biggest questions that I don't understand after reading the book, the things that held me up as a reader. So it will not be nearly the depth level, but it will at least help get you on your way for revisions.
Yeah.
But I've heard about alpha reading, and I did it once with a client, and it was more that alpha reading is this idea, and I see it more with people who have friends who are alpha readers, so they're really informally, but do a book and they'll be in the first draft stages and they'll send it to someone to review chapter by chapter. And in that case with the one person I was sort of working with for science fiction, it was more that she had started it. She's kind of frustrated on how to make the first 4 or 5 chapters go to set up the world building and the characters. And I was helping her more with that. So we'd also meet on voice chat after I'd sent the notes back for author coaching. But I've
Yeah.
just had from a personal angle where I've shared things where chapters of works in progress that haven't really been fully drafted yet, where for me, I realized over time it didn't work for me as a writer. But do you have feelings on alpha reading?
Since I only heard about it like very recently, not a lot of feelings, but I do think that it might be more difficult to execute your own vision if you are consistently talking with someone else about it. So it sort of depends. I think that if you're like got one chapter in the bank and then you go and you pay someone to be your alpha reader where they're going to read the first chapter and give you feedback and then you write another chapter and give you feedback, that might be a little too intense for you. You'd probably start losing your concept. That's been sometimes the problem with writing groups where you come in chapter by chapter and everybody has their own opinion, but they don't know where you're going with it yet, and they're not going to read the rest of it because it's not written yet. Maybe if you're in the situation where you're like, okay, I've got the first 5 chapters and I need someone to help me suss out, am I doing the world building the way that I should? Am I setting things up the way that I would for this genre? Am I doing certain things? Like you might be moving in with that kind of thing. But I also think that coaching exists for a reason. And it would help you do like you did this with a coaching client, as it would help you say, okay, well, we're just going to look at this and talk through it and try to get them to get a sense of where they want to go. I don't know if people do this through the entire book where it's chapter by chapter. At that point, it feels like a lot like co-writing.
Yeah, exactly. And then the final one that I want to talk about in sort of the list of all the things going on, because it does feel like a lot of terms if you're a new author and you're like, okay, I've written something, I'm very proud that I wrote it, but where are my steps? And you hear dev editing or line editing or you feel like a lot of things at once. But There is the question of what is and do I need a sensitivity reader? Do you want to say what a sensitivity reader is in general, Midnight?
Generally, we think of a sensitivity reader as someone who is going to read your text specifically for how you have represented one identity or core issue. If you are not an Asian American person, but you have some significant characters in this and you're unsure of how you're representing the culture or how they um, represent themselves, then you might be looking for a sensitivity reader who is Asian American and would be able to like give you a heads up on tropes that you had no idea were a thing. I think
Like, for
that's where the
example,
sensitivity, go ahead.
yeah, you think when you're writing your Asian heroine and she's got like a streak of magenta hair and her otherwise dark hair that you're doing something really novel, but there's literally a whole trope and stereotype about like the cool punk Asian girl who's got that one streak of brightly colored dyed hair and it's problematic. But you don't know that. But the sensitivity reader can point that out to you because they're aware of it from within their own community.
Yeah. And you don't know what you don't know. I think that's why we have the whole sensitivity reader thing is because again, we want to pay people for their labor. So it's not really cool just to go to your gay friends and say, okay, can you read this for me and do this work as an editor? You don't
But
necessarily know from inside the community, like the depth of the things that are on their periphery every day. So going to someone who's experienced that does help you try in a way.
yeah, it's like microaggression. It's like, hey, I need to profit from your lived experience. Can you just do this whole read a book and give me notes thing for completely free, bestie? Like it's not appropriate to ask your friend just because they are black or Latina or, Jewish or gay and be like, can you just do that for like it's rude. And it takes a cost. Sometimes you're reading a book and there are microaggressions or slights, or like you read something and it misrepresents who you are or who your group is, and the person may not have meant it, but it still hurts. There is that also. There's the toll or effort that has to go into doing sensitivity reading style. I do it for queer women characters. I'm bisexual. For queer women characters, and I do it for bipolar disorder because I haven't. I'll read for those two issues. And so sometimes for me, if especially if I'm reading for bipolar disorder and I see something that it doesn't mean that the author wasn't trying, but they got it wrong. So it's very harmful to read, or it's repurposing or re-putting out like really cruddy stereotypes about us that I don't, it hurts me to read that. I'm very happy. I'm always happy to help people with it because I really want there to be good rep for people who are bipolar. But it's still that initial read through and helping them figure out the plan. There can be a cost of, oh, I wish you hadn't presented them in that manic episode that way. That's really not what it's like, and it makes us look like monsters. It takes a toll on people, so that's why they should be people who, do it professionally, people who you contract and pay for an honest day's work. If you're gonna eventually sell this book and try and profit from it, then the least you can do is help your sensitivity reader and respect them and their lived experience and the expertise they're giving you by paying them fairly.
I would add, yeah, pay them fairly. This is another thing that I have seen people will trade on, though, like within indie communities. They say, I need someone to be a sensitivity reader for this. Is there anybody who needs a sensitivity reader for what I have? So
Yeah,
you
I
can
consider
also
swaps.
benefit from that, from swaps. I also want to add that if people are at this point thinking, oh, well, I'm not going to be mean to people, so I won't do it, I will bring our attention to like the great lesbian die off on TV. It was like 2016.
Yeah, it
Um,
was. Yeah, it was awful.
yeah, so like basically what happens and the reason people can fall afoul of this with entirely without intending to, it's also the Asian hair strike thing. I feel like that's part of it, of where you see this narrative so commonly that it starts to feel true. So even if you're up in your head creating the most fantastic world and everything's going along, but then you have this type of person and the narratives that you've seen have suggested this is the ending for this kind of person. So it just kind of feels like the right one. And you're used to going with your intuition because you're following what the characters are doing. But to some degree, you've seen this narrative before because someone back in the 50s decided that queer people can't have a happy ending. So you've seen it so many times that you can't look at it clearly. It really does help to have someone else say, okay, well, this is a common thing. And once you see it, It's hard to not see it.
Yeah, like I had a friend who, in all good intentions, she was talking about a book idea she had, and she was like, I want to set it at Pride. I'm like, oh, that's great. And she's like, I want to set it at Pride where two allies fall in love with each other, so it's their love story. And I was, well, maybe you shouldn't do that, both because if you're going to set something at a gay Pride event, maybe the protagonist should be queer within the queer community. And I don't mean like two bisexuals or pansexuals who happen to be like I mean, one male and one female, and they're like in what looks like a plain straight relationship if you don't ask, or someone who's asexual, or someone who's in the closet. I mean, people who are just legit straight allies, cis het allies, but they fall in love, and the focus of them is their love story at Queer Pride, and you're like, wait, what? But also because in that case, it's not like she was aware of the fact that so much of the stereotyping around gay characters, especially male gay characters, and the best gay friend trope is that they
Yeah.
exist, support, and essentially be, pun intended, the fairy godfathers for the relationship advice for straight couples. And so it just felt like yet another iteration of the tired trope of gay people only exist to matchmake for straight people.
Yeah.
But she didn't know what she didn't know. So, but sometimes you just
Yeah.
aren't aware of it, you know?
Yeah.
The next thing is I think we touched on it a little bit because I can't talk about sending things to the editor at this point in my life without saying you need to like have read your manuscript. You need to know what's in it. You
Yeah.
need to have edited it because you cannot send me your first draft. Please stop doing that. Um,
Okay, so this is something that you've said a lot of if you don't want to read your own manuscript, why should someone else want to read it? Right? Like you've gotten through it and you're so tired and you're like, I did it, I succeeded, I wrote the thing, and then you just throw it at someone else because you don't want to look at it anymore. You got to resist that urge because before you get it to the other editor, there are a lot of reasons that you want to be able to reread through it a couple of times to make sure that it's as error-free as you can get and as consistent and as well developed as what you want it to be before someone else steps in and gets their fingers on it.
yeah, the notes you pointed out do three drafts of just the self-editing, and that makes sense because you write it, you like get ready to developmentally edit, looking for the plot holes. Then you go through the line edit to make it read well for flow, and then you want to make sure you don't have typos. Like you don't want to send out like, "Here's my garbage, please fix it."
That's what you do with your papers in college. Honestly, it's you're like, I'm tired of this. And then after this, I won't have to be responsible for it because I'm just a student. When you know that you're going to be the author, then you want to be a little more like, okay, this is mine. I am proud of it, even though if I'm tired right now. Um, Self-editing can actually be very difficult because of things that I call like the mental autocorrect. This happens to students all the time where they read it and they read what they meant for it to be like, or they've imagined the scene in their head so they know how it goes. There are a couple of things that you can do to disrupt that autocomplete. You can read it out loud. That is a standard structure in writing centers at colleges. They will sit there and they will read the text out loud. And then your ear will actually catch some things that just don't make sense.
And
The
if you
thing you
don't
can do
like
is
reading out loud, the computer can, like Microsoft can read it for you. You don't even need a special program.
that's true. Um, yeah, they have them on there already on Microsoft and also Adobe PDFs, like in various programs, they'll have it ready for you to read out loud for accessibility reasons, actually.
Yeah.
Another thing I was going to say is if you set something aside for a week, you're going to forget. So if you have the time, that might be your first one of set it aside for a week
Yeah.
so that you don't remember and then go back and read it. You'll have experienced this if you got away from your draft and then you're rereading it and you're thinking, okay, I need to write the next scene, but I have no idea what's going on. You do get disfamiliar from it. You can also just print out a copy and edit it by hand. And that works in the same way that it would if you changed the font or put it in a different program or something, because then it's not as familiar. So there
I
are
had
things you can do to set that up for you.
I had gotten away from editing by hand for my own work lately, but I actually did it because I put some pages in a contest. And I was like, I really want to get these pages good to make them look well. Sorry, I'm tired. So I flipped the modifiers, but you know what I mean. And I was like, I've done it from reading from the screen for a long time. Let me print it out the way I used to do it in college and print it out and then red pen it. And it really helped because, like, just the modality change really makes you see things you didn't see on a screen. I'm going to be really honest with that. It really helps.
You're just tricking your brain into letting you do the work that you're trying to do.
Yeah. I tend to think that if you're finished a full first draft of a novel, that a week is a good time to set it aside, perhaps, but I want more 3 to 4 weeks. I want you to have like that month off to take a breath, not be immersed in it, kind of forget some of the details. So when you go back, it's more obvious. You're like, wait, did I forget a scene here? Or he said that, but why did that make sense for her to answer that question back? Where you can really not get into that self-fulfilling my brain's filling in the blanks anymore stage. I think it sometimes
Yeah,
takes close to a month to do that.
yeah, giving it to time to work on something else or to work on all the nasty PR stuff that you have to do as an
Yeah.
author or
Yeah.
these days, um, would help you do that. The reason that we're so adamant about this is not just because we want less to work to do. It's because it changes the kind of work that the editor is going to do for you in positive ways if you edit it yourself a little bit on the front end. So I will say, for example, what would you do if some client gave you a manuscript that had no editing and no paragraph breaks?
Well, I learned that the hard way. I actually sent that manuscript back, and you're gonna laugh because people are like, "Oh, surely the manuscripts all have paragraphs in them," but they don't. So I sent this book back to this particular person who was working on a memoir, and I was like, I cannot edit this by doing your pagination. I'm not gonna decide which paragraph is which and like break up your literal mega block Faulkner style paragraph that literally lasts the whole book for you. So please, retab this so you have actual paragraphs. And that author did that, and it was sent back to me about 4 or 5 weeks later. And they were like, wow, this was really tricky. It took forever. And I'm like, yes, that's why you had to do it yourself. And actually, in my contracts and on site and information about me from going forward, you must have broken this down into paragraphs and into separate chapters. If I find you have sent me a manuscript that doesn't do it, I will send it back and not start editing till it is in that form.
Yeah, because you need to be the one to make decisions about where the paragraph breaks are. Like as
Yeah.
there, to some degree, we can say, okay, you have too many paragraphs that are just one sentence, or maybe you shouldn't have a paragraph that's 3 pages long. But you need to be making the conceptual understanding of how is my reader going to read this? Like that needs to be you on the end as the writer.
It's like an exhaustion thing because I contracted with a group that for a while would definitely send me as the dev editor working under them manuscripts that were first drafts to please the clients who wanted to get, I guess, faster into the market. And so I have spent a lot of the last couple of years reading manuscripts that were, to put it bluntly, not ready for prime time. So I would be reading things and like reading tons of typos or like plot threads were started, but obviously the author never came back when they finished the book and like reintegrated them so they made sense, or plot thread was completely dropped 2/3 of the way through the book. And it was just these frustrating experiences where I'd love to tell you more how to fix your characters or make their conflict really resonate. But I'm still stuck at the level of like, I thought they had a dog named Sparky. Where'd Sparky go? You know what I mean?
Yeah. I think part of that problem is when you are a discovery writer, and to some degree, I just have to admit that I am. I do plan to some degree, but I can't plan everything or I get bored. As a discovery writer, that I'm going to be doing a lot more self-editing than anyone else, or it's going to be a disaster. And when you have the discovery writing, if you go straight through and you're not like a perennial, like rewrite the first chapters person like me, then y- you're going to be getting to the very end where you have the payoff, but you've never planted the seeds because you just decided this was the twist. You don't want the reader to be there, and you definitely don't want the dev editor to be going like, I don't understand how to help you do this because it looks like this just came out of nowhere. So what you're doing as a discovery writer in that self as a edit is going back and making sure like you did all of this on purpose. And so that when your editor gets to it, they can give you the best feedback from your best version of this. Then they can really give you more specified help.
Yeah, I think people are like maybe thinking, oh, theoretically, Midnight and Margaret just don't want to work as much. or something with editors feeling a little bit less ambitious. It isn't that, but you're right. We keep coming back to the theme, the idea that we can give you our best work if you give us the best work you've gotten to at that point. And it's really more about maximizing the money you're spending because I want the developmental edits or the line edits to be as useful for you as possible. But if you're giving me, like you said, the college metaphor, I just posted this off at the last minute garbage, then I'm not, I can only polish a turd so much. Like, I want you to send me the best version you have so I can give you edits that can make it an even better version that can really take it to that next level. And I don't want to shortchange you what could come out of this relationship if you haven't put the effort in yet on your end.
So let's give a different example of one of the things that the dev editor is going to be looking at is the world building and characterization of the plot. And I mentioned one of the problems with the plot is that, like, okay, you came up with the twist at the very end. Happens. If you need help with characterization, but you have not characterized this character yet because you haven't gotten that far. So, like, you've written the whole book, but then this character who's very important doesn't have any motivation whatsoever. And they're very flat, they're inconsistent, and you haven't gone back to try to infuse what you want from that character, then your editor may be giving you advice that you don't even need because you want the character to eventually go somewhere else, but they're not going to know that because it's not on the page. They can't read your mind. If you can go back and like get that in there in as much as you can, then they can give you the best suggestions of the way to do that.
Yeah, exactly. Speaks to the relationship that comes up between editor and client. So what do we want to say that a person who's looking to get editing, an author who's looking to start their relationship with an editor, like what do they need to expect about how that working relationship will go?
I don't know where to start with this one.
Fair. Like, I mean, I know sometimes it's hard because you'll give advice to your client and you'll say, you could do X, Y, or Z to fix, you know, how chapter 20 seems to drag. And sometimes the client will be like, well, I have a purpose for that. And I know it seems like it doesn't work, but I want to do it this way for my reasons. And I guess sometimes there's like this sort of U-shaped curve between when it's best to take advice from the editor or when it's sometimes like you know yourself, you know what you're trying to do with the manuscript, and sometimes you are free to like leave advice the editor gives because at the end of the day, you are making the final decisions about what goes in your book.
Like, that's the thing that you want to keep in mind to the begin with. One, you're paying an editor. That's their investment in this. Like, they may like your story, but they know, okay, I need to give you as much as I have from my expertise to help you achieve your goals. So they're going to tell you things you may not like them. This you're paying them to tell you things. So that's thing one, is that they're gonna tell you stuff that may be criticisms and, you just get along with that. The second thing is that you're the one who's in charge, you're the one who is gonna make these final decisions because your name is gonna be on it. Sometimes you'll thank your editor in it, but often you don't. Is that that's not really their job to be on the book as the co-writer because they're not.
No.
And so you have to understand that there's to some degree, you want to be able to filter through their advice and say, okay, this is what they're telling me from their expertise that I want to listen to and consider. And then this is something that I know I understand their point of view, but I still want to do it my way. And that shouldn't be along the lines of basic grammar because that's confusing for readers. But if you know the purpose of what you're trying to accomplish, you can do a better job of deciding what advice to take as you go through. I had a good
Yeah.
example of this. We're gonna interview this person later, someone who came to me as a coaching client, and she had her whole book finished. So, and it was not even the first draft. I think it was like the third. And so, because she had such strong ideas about what she wanted to do, when I went through and gave her what ifs, she was able to discard three and keep one because I'm spitballing at the wall of ways that we can make this work, and she knows where she wants to go, so she can pick up on which one of the mad generative ideas that I come up with is going to be the best for doing what she wants to do.
Yeah, you really need to know. And that, again, that helps if you've gone through three or four drafts and you know what your vision is and have refined it. if someone suggests something and it doesn't work for you, you need to have that vision to know that it doesn't and why and how you're going for that ultimate purpose of what you want the readers to get out of it. Sure, you want them to get out a fun story, but usually there's a theme, there's a purpose, there's a tone, there's something you're trying to convey. And if I give you an idea of a possible way to solve a problem and that's not going with sort of the tone of the book I want, then you would know that. And again, we're only at the end of the day, you're right, the service providers. So, we don't have the ultimate say, but we are trying to offer you things from our experience that might help you when you kind of are in the ditch or you're like, oh, I have this problem. Do you have ideas on how I can fix it? So you don't have to take every piece of our advice, but you should probably take some because on the other end of, I feel like maybe on a relationship with an editor who is a bit more exacting than I wanted at first is also okay, if you go get an editor, but you don't take most of their advice or 90% of the advice, like why did that happen at all?
Yeah, this especially goes to the developmental edit because it is the big ticket item. It's like you ordered the lobster and you pushed it around the plate and then, like, left. Is that you've got the most expensive thing, they put their most effort into it, and then you just really wanted to say that you'd had the editing done, and then you just do line edits and move on without taking any advice, or at least considering what they think the problems are. If you're gonna do
Yeah.
that, you might as well just get line editing and not bother because it's expensive. Yeah, and you should get dev editing, but if you're not gonna take your dev editor's advice ever, then why are you paying for it? It is expensive. Generally speaking, if you've gotten a dev edit and you look at this and you say, "Well, there's a lot of things that I need to rewrite," then take some time with it. Try to think about what they say the problems are, what parts you are willing to change, and how structurally you're going to be able to change that. Because if they're giving you overall edits on characterization or plot or things like that, then it's not going to be a sentence or two fix. But you did pay for this so that you will do the next level of the work and then move on to the next section. I have had people do multiple rounds of dev edits with me. Like they would do the first version and then revise, and then they would let me look at the next part, bundled it so it wasn't as expensive. I was able to give them a second layer of feedback on how far they'd gone and a few other things they could do before they take it into line editing.
Yeah, and I've had the reverse experience where, again, as a contractor, I had someone who had written the whole series and then all like four or five, six installments. I can't remember how many there were, and so she was bringing them to me, but she already had book two, three, and four in the can. And I'm telling you that book one has severe structural problems and the heroine isn't particularly likable, things like that. But, I'd get the draft back for the line edits, and it was clear that she'd added a paragraph or two and a few chapters like peppered, like scattered out that way to try and fix it, but she hadn't really fixed it. And I was making enough to pay half my rent on these edits. And I'm like, it worked out for me, but I don't know why you did that if you had everything locked into how books two, three, and four had to go and then nothing really changed. Like, I get that you got nothing out of this relationship, but again, I was under contract, so I had to keep doing it for the overall organization. But I was just thinking, but you have the chance to change it, and then yeah, you'll have to significantly then rewrite books two, three, four, etc. But they'll be better books, and people will want to be your audience. But go
I
figure.
guess for me, if I got that and I had already written, that would have happened with me. I would never have 5 books written at once. But
Mhm.
so let's say that I got really inspired and I wrote all 5 books in a series already, and then I went to editors, and then on the first one, they gave me very specific advice about the characterization. That would mean that I could go ahead and start revising books 2 and 3, because that advice probably will apply to those later books. If your heroine is too passive in book 1, they're probably gonna be too passive in the following books. There are things on that laundry list where you could say, "Can I check on these other ones before I send it off for editing?" and save yourself some time. As I understand that there's sometimes people are on a timeline, and there is this tendency now to just write the series as one big mega book and then cut it into 3 pieces. There are other reasons you shouldn't do that, but let's say you're really good at that and still having coherent character arcs. Um, it means that when you revise the first one, you still have to revise the next 2 because the
You
changes in the
do.
first one are gonna change the rest.
It ripples. I also think people, even if I'm not working through a contract organization, just one-on-one with indie authors, especially because there's a lot of pressure not just to produce every so often to beat the algorithm at Amazon and stay visible, but also because people really want to get that extra boost of pre-orders. And if you cancel a pre-order on Amazon, you're not allowed to pre-order again for like a year. So I get sometimes I'll have a client who is on a deadline because they've self-imposed it, but also because if they don't, they can't get it done again for a year for a pre-order, and that's hard. But then what happens is if you're doing that, you've got to give yourself enough time. You've got to be realistic
Yeah.
with your time frame. If I get it to the development editor by January, then I can go through my edits and then some line edits and then etc. and have the book out by June and just be planning your production schedule that much in advance. Don't be like, oh, if I give it to my developmental editor
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
February, then I can have a turnaround and get it up by April 1st. Then you're not going to really do the changes you need. You're
Yeah,
just
I
not.
did have a client who did the mega book, and she was planning ahead enough that like I was doing it in June and it was going to be coming out next February or something, like the first one. So she knew that she would need some time to do the developmental changes and then the line edits and then get it into the next one and then like the whole editing process for the next group. So the what her workflow was actually right, the three, and then get the first book into editing and then start working on that and then the second book and then the third book in order, but then it's far enough out into the future that she knows that she can get that work done. But if you're expecting, okay, well, I'm going to write a book a month, it'll just be published at the end of the month, that's not enough time. I don't know that's enough time to write the book because I have done ghostwriting, God bless me, and like doing 30K in 30 days is enough, let alone writing like an actual sized book and then getting rounds of editing done is untenable.
It is. I mean, I see a lot of people who were doing that 10 years ago in early independent publishing. They're gone now. They don't do it anymore. Or I can tell you from having been a ghostwriter in a couple different places early on that a lot of these people who you go like, how do they get a book every 3 weeks? They're not. They have ghostwriters or a team of them under
Yeah.
non-disclosure agreements who are helping them with that. But one human being can't keep up that schedule. I know it's not possible. And I say this as a bipolar person who can have like hypomanic episodes.
Yeah,
You
and you
still
write
can't
very,
sustain
very
that.
fast when you want to. So
Yeah,
like
when I can
you
sustain it.
can get words down on a page.
Are they any
But
good? At the end, yeah.
your words are good always, but like I don't think they're to the degree that you want them to be.
No, not the
Let's say it
30
that
day
way.
novellas I would throw out as a ghostwriter for our friend
Yeah,
Aunt.
those maybe not. Well, you didn't come
No,
up with the concept for those, so we'll
they
give you
were, by the way,
maybe.
these odd little like romances that involved royalty or sheiks or whatever, and always the heroine had to get pregnant because he loves the secret baby or whatever. So they were what
That
they
part was
were.
so wild.
It was wild. Once he wanted sextuplets, which I did by surprise. And I was like, I don't even know if it's possible to have sextuplets without IVF, but it is. Once in 2009 in England, they happened to naturally. And I'm like, that poor woman. But not to get too far afield, I think you need to realize you have to give yourself enough time, and if you're trying to do everything a book a month, then okay, great. This is the book that's coming out 10 months from now. But don't put
Yeah.
yourself in a place where you're going to be like, oh, I got the dev edits. I've got 2 weeks to fix them. And then you kind of sort of fix a little bit with like a band-aid. And you're like, oh, well, the readers still didn't like it. I wonder what happened. Don't set yourself up for failure.
Yeah.
Okay, so we talked about what editing is and what the types are and what your relationship is in it and like how as the author you're sort of in control, but how do I find an editor then? Like if I'm the
Oh,
author, how am I going to figure out like someone who works for me or like matches my style or like where do I've just finished a book. I have no idea where to even start.
Google?
Yeah, I mean that couldn't hurt. I've always been maybe it's because I'm a millennial, so I'm old enough to still have Facebook and use it, not like the cool kids these days, I guess. Because there are a lot of good authors groups that you can ask. If you join a local writers group, then obviously other writers will know where they get their editor from. Google is a great one because you can Google it and sites will pop up. I actually, when we were naming our company Otherlands Editing, I was looking for something that would be kind of speculative, and I just put in the word like science fiction editors, and I got like a full page of like science fiction and fantasy editors, and that helped me be like, okay, these cool names are taken. What isn't yet? So
Yeah, I
What
think that the thing is, you mentioned the Facebook groups. There are like so many independent editors out there. Like you throw a rock and they're like, I can edit your manuscript for you. And the thing is, a lot of them will end up having their own website because it helps distinguish them slightly when somebody puts in, I need an editor, and 500 people rush to comment on the
it's true.
post. It's just like a feeding frenzy. Please pick me. I need to pay my rent.
It's
Um,
definitely like that. Um,
but if you look for the website, then you can look at what kinds of things that they offer and specifically what genres they focus on, other things that they offer as their expertise. That would take us to the things that you don't necessarily need to look for. You don't need to look for someone who says this one edited best-selling whatever, because the editor is not involved in that marketing process. So that's not necessarily where you want to start. You probably want to look at the testimonials on their page. You want to see that they're in the genre that you're in and they know the beats of what you're looking at. Also, you want to think about like how they edit and how well that's going to fit you.
yeah, I would go back for a second to that idea of looking at their site and evaluating their skills. Because if I have a memoir and I go to us, and I'm like, I have this, we've had to do it in the past because sometimes money is money, but I'm not a memoir expert per se. But if I'm someone who's coming to us for memoir or for like women's fiction or for like literature or Nicholas Sparks style books, because I do romance, but I don't do books where it's a bittersweet thing where the characters die at the end wistfully, like The Notebook. If you come to me with those kind of things, I can't help you because I don't read that. So I don't know enough about those genres to help you. It's like why I don't edit for high fantasy or hard science fiction. I appreciate every genre for what it is, but I don't read it, so I can't help you. Like, I don't know
Yeah.
if you're hitting the right beats and tropes.
Well, and that's why our site has you and me combined, is so that I can hit some of that fantasy stuff that you're not as familiar with.
Yeah, and like if you went to midnight and it's like, I've got this contemporary billionaire romance, what do I do? She'd be like, especially if it's like a hit for sexual contemporary billionaire romance, she'd be like, well, that sounds like a job for not me because she doesn't read them. So how can you have an editor who doesn't really read in the genre you're trying to get help with? You
I'd
really
say,
can't.
please take that to Margaret.
I've
She's
done more
read
than my fair share.
many of
Yeah,
those.
yeah. He's not dark enough. Give him more torture and man pain. It's that idea. And then also with how you're going to fit with your editor is super important. And I say this as someone who has had editors for her stuff in the past, or at least someone I went to for some feedback on things long ago. And she was trying to be helpful as a friend, but because I was entering things to contests, and this is like 7 years back, but she was so harsh with her criticism. Sometimes I just didn't want to write after talking to her for a couple weeks after each time. Not because she was mean, she was just coming at it from a different angle than I could tolerate, if that makes sense. Like our styles didn't match. So sometimes you have to have someone who matches, whether they're going to be your drill sergeant and really just tell it to you like it is. They're going to be kind of like the nurturing preschool teacher who's like, I've got ideas, don't worry about it. You've got to find what fits for you because writing's such a personal process.
Yeah. How would you determine whether they were going to be a good fit for you?
From the editing perspective, I try and offer potential clients as much breathing room as they can to get to know me. Like I have a few clients, our friend Ellie's one of them. She'll also be on the podcast later, who I've edited for in the past, who will agree to be emailed by potential clients to ask for like how was working with Margaret, was she good, what did she do, and they're very generous that they offer that. So I'm very grateful to Ellie and a couple others who will do that for me. But also I think sample edits really help, and it's not just for the editor to show off what they can do. It's to see like, okay, I want to see if when, especially for developmental edits, less line edits, people aren't necessarily as attached to the flow of their sentences. But for developmental edits, if I send you back something and you read my comments and my letter and you're like, this style just isn't for me, at least you know what you're going to get a preview of what'll be more extensive feedback if you actually hired me. So that way you can tell if like, oh, she's really kind of positive. She puts things in the compliment sandwich. She always ends on an upbeat. I like this, as opposed to someone who might be a little bit more direct or someone who might have a more flowery style of giving feedback, whatever. At least if you get sample feedback, you get to know how it would be in a bigger relationship.
I wouldn't be afraid to ask for what you need too, because
Yeah.
sometimes your editor may be in so much in fix it mode of I really want to help this person do X that they're not giving you as much positive feedback as you want. Now, don't expect for the most part that they're going to be like flowery, like I love this and love this because they're not your buddy. Their job is to help you. But I have had the case where I was working with a client and I gave them some extensive feedback on developmental edit. And I did have some compliments in there, but it didn't get across as much. So they felt a little demoralized and they told me. So I was able to say, okay, let me go a little harder on the things that were good so that you know where they are. So if you find yourself in a working relationship and you're thinking, okay, well, this isn't quite working, you can ask for what you need. And then if it still doesn't work, get another editor. Like it's like that if I had someone who was like really needed that, I'd probably send them to Market because you're really good at giving both the positive and the negative without drilling down too hard and getting hyper focused. But it happens. So
Look,
like
that's 4 years of sorority rush where you have to be like, this was good,
snaps.
this needs work, yeah, this still is good. So like my sorority days did come in handy. Snaps.
Yeah, I'm an English teacher, so I have to keep in mind that I need to say the positive things too, because otherwise you won't want to write. So
Yeah. And your editor wants you to keep writing most of the time. They do. So you want to find the person who works well with you and whose style fits you. And you can be like, yeah, I need the English teacher who's third or fourth grade English teacher. So she's a little cuddlier. Or I need the drill sergeant because I need my butt kicked. You just need to make those decisions.
yeah,
So, the last sort of idea on our list of things we wanted to hit was, okay, but editors cost money and I don't have any. So can I just use AI?
no.
Why can't I use artificial intelligence? It's cheaper just to have a subscription.
Yeah, okay. So I'm just going to give my perspective as an editor and a teacher. First thing that I would say as an editor is that I've been hearing stories of people who paid an editor to edit it and then they put it through an AI and it didn't give the author what they wanted. In fact, it ended up screwing with the language. So from teacher perspective, what I know that AI does that's really irritating is that it flattens out your voice. When I'm reading college papers, I can almost always tell when they've used the AI to either edit it or just write it entirely because it ends up using words commonly that are not common. Like I know from this tell of the way that they're using the words that they have this empty prose, this doubling of verbs, of like badly added things, and it's mayonnaise language that is not palatable by itself. Like it's missing you. And because writing voice is so important that you don't want the AI to autocomplete your work. You want it to be as human as possible.
There's
Also,
one
if you
thing,
don't know how to edit, then you don't know when it did things wrong.
yeah, you really don't. But I think one other thing is artificial intelligence isn't actually intelligence. I don't know much about computers, but from what little I do know about my new enemy, is it's a large language model. So what it works on is basically autocomplete at a bigger scale. So
Yeah.
it's looking at from all the data I've illegally swept up and combed through, and I've got this prompt or the start of something. What is the next most logical, most expected conclusion? But with creativity, which I do know about because I studied it in college and I wrote a paper on it, it's the exact opposite. It's what we call, from the psychological perspective, of making loose associations in the mind. It's the least expected answer you could come up with that still makes some sense to continue to create something that's never existed before in exactly that way. So that's part of the voice is being unique, is being individualized. Part of good writing is being able to create something that subverts the expectations or surprises readers. And you can't do that fundamentally if you're working with a system that is basically giant autocomplete because it's going to give the most cliched, typical, expected, standard ideas just to keep moving. And those are literally at polar opposites of each other.
Yeah, so we're talking specifically about the large language models. And when you say the ones, so they've swept up all of these things from the internet, it means, yeah, literally they've taken other text in order to train themselves, and then they will repeat whatever that is, including which one was it? Was it pseudo right or one of
It was pseudo
the
right, I think.
oh
They
my
had
gosh, where
swept Archive of Our Own, and they had
and
swept
so
so much supernatural fan fiction. So
which is going to give you certain practices that don't belong in a contemporary,
you
especially on
mean
the sexual
Omegaverse
end.
and nodding, yeah.
Yeah,
But it's easy
it
to
comes
tell because it doesn't
across.
exist anywhere else. And so when they swept Archive Our Own, which has tons of stories with it, and all of a sudden you're writing there's a typical billionaire romance, and suddenly both characters are decided to be named Dean and Castiel or whatever. You're like, oh, and we get to page 30 and stuff is happening that is not going to happen in a regular contemporary romance. But also authors who had never been to AO3 would have no idea it existed. Like it was just an easy tell that that's what happened, that had been like regurgitated from copied fanfic. And that's not the point, although we do
Yeah.
mention of Megaverse a lot, which is really something we're going to have to ask Ellie when she gets here someday for her guest interview. But the point is that it is plagiaristic. It has swept up other people's work, but then what comes back out are iterations of that work or echoes of that work, or even sometimes the literal ideas from that work. But it's all trying to be the most expected answers it can be. And that really, you're right, it flattens out voice. So when I saw someone at a Facebook group go, should I use artificial intelligence? Should I use generative AI to write my query letter to an agent? Everybody there was like, don't do that. That's going to make you sound as flat as possible. I mentioned that in my own comment there. If there was ever any time to distinguish yourself by your voice, it is when you are trying to query an agent to get a book deal. Oh my goodness.
Are you really going to let an AI screw it up and
Yeah,
go back through and make it sound like lowest common denominator? You don't want to do that. We have seen people on the Facebook posts where they had someone like the editor would put it back through AI and then they have to go get a different editor to fix the problem. So you're just sort of like going into sunk cost at that point because of using it. I'm not
I've
saying no
seen it more often.
algorithms ever have use, but like in this one in particular, it's sort of antithetical to what we're trying to accomplish.
I think if you also, and this is sort of a side note, but if you've ever used the Bing AI generator or you've used AI generators for pictures and you see how, I'm going to be really honest with you, how bad they are at generating pictures of either just women in general, because they all come out as either infantilized and looking too much like children or like a comic book character with giant boobs and a boob window, or characters of color, people of color, Black people, Latinos, they often come out like again, especially I've because I will use it sometimes to look for fanfic purposes, just for inspiration for like a Latina character. Always comes out with like boobs, and you're like they just reduce people to like their stereotypes, especially people who are minorities, marginalized. They come out with like these sort of over sexualized versions, and you're like, if this is what it does to flatten out and like stereotype women or women of color especially, what is it doing to my writing if this is what it does to just images or pictures I'm trying to generate? Like what is it actually spitting back out, and how like sort of not just lowest common denominator but often cliche and stereotype in the worst way ridden is it?
Yeah. So let's say that even if you maybe you're just the best person ever at creating prompts and you were able to get it to work, how does having the AI as the editor or the creator impact you legally?
Well, technically people don't know yet, but I can say that they haven't had definitive case law either way. So it's hard to say that if you even own that property, like if you can get it copyrighted right now, you can't. Unfortunately, that might change depending on certain legal cases, but right now you cannot copyright work that was created with AI or generated and then I guess a substantial portion re-edited with it. So if you have it, now you can't like keep the copyright. So if you sell it, someone else could rip you off, which is kind of a funny in a circle of life kind of way, but you can't own it. So that's going to be a problem. It's also why people who want to have AI covers, and I don't believe in stealing art from artists either, but I'm also saying that when they do that, people are, well, you can't, that's not really your image. Even if you brand with it or use it on your cover, use it on your website, put it on merchandise, someone else could use it tomorrow because you can't copyright it. So it's not just morally and environmentally icky, it's also you're cutting off your nose to spite your face because you don't really own it.
Yeah. And then is it the case that people have been kicked out of literary contests for it? Is it like there are certain cases where it can like the use of the editing
Yeah,
because of that legal
yeah,
ambiguity?
I've seen it in some contests. I can't remember which ones, but it's a couple places. I've seen journals where they've had to say we're limiting our submission or we're changing our submission process because we've been flooded with AI, like short stories that have just been churned out. We can't handle the
Yeah.
flow of it. I've even seen it in art contests, which I know is not the same exactly because we're talking about writing. But I saw where one artist, air quotes, big air quotes, the ultimate shade and side eye, had submitted a picture for like a county art event and they won first place and they won like $500 and people pointed out that they had posted 6 months ago on their Instagram about that same piece that they had created using AI and they got in trouble. There's a right, like this is in like Missouri. It was nowhere near me and I live in Maryland, but I still heard about it. They had to give back the prize money. It was a mess. So yeah, a lot of contests, a lot of literary journals and magazines are like, we are not taking it. Worse than that, they're getting flooded with the stuff they have to divide the wheat from the chaff. And so it's actually slowing down their process of judging contests or their process of getting books or short stories that they want to put up in their site or publish at all. So it's making it 10 times worse.
Yeah. Well, we have to live with it for now. I think the takeaway for AI and editors is that you should probably get it in the contract that your editor's not going to use it.
And
It's
vice
in
versa,
our
editors will do
contract
it.
that, yeah, because if you find out that they do, you have some kind of legal recourse if you both promise not to. And for us, we put it in our contract that we are not here to edit other people's. So if it's in the contract that says you're not supposed to use AI, don't do that because
Because in our
then,
contract, we also say if we catch you or we realize it's been used and created by generative AI, we will cancel the contract and keep the down payment. And we make people
yes.
sign to that. So we're very, in our case, we're very serious about it. And it's a legal protection both ways because if you're the client, you're right. It helps you too if you don't want AI used to edit, air quotes, your book.
Yeah, and I think that's where it came from when we saw the a person who had given it to an editor who put it through an AI. That editor had promised to actually edit it. Having Grammarly do it for you does not count.
Exactly. Or pro writing aid or whatever.
Yeah,
So
so
that
like the
poor
editor
client
should
was
not
out
be
in the money.
promising to give you that human touch and then do it to the AI. That's unethical, to say the least.
Yeah, to say the least, it's unethical. I think we've gone through all the points you were wanting to talk to today about editors and finding them in different types of editing and relationships. What is your takeaway or the one thing or two things you want the listeners to think about when they take away from this episode or think about editing and finding an editor in general? I mean, for me, I would say that if I had two things to say, it'd be do your research, really look into people you're thinking of hiring. And that would be if it was your car mechanic or your dentist, too. You know what I mean? But do your research, look through their site. If they give you the option to contact old clients or see a sample, do that. Kick the tires as much as you can. The other thing I would say is that editing is a tool for you. So, like, give yourself the ultimate chance to make it work. Like, find the editor who works well with you but also don't hem yourself in with a time constraint you can't meet. You're going to set yourself up for failure if you're going to try and do it to the algorithm, try and do it to a time frame that you literally can't meet. Give yourself and your editor the room you need to do the best job.
Okay. I might say that when you're looking for an editor, above all, remember that you're the author and that your ownership over your text is very important. It is something that's going to represent you as a writer, and your service to yourself and the story is what comes up top. That leads you in how you make these choices for who's going to be working with you and how much effort you're going to be putting in on the other end once you get those notes.
And I guess one thing that came to my mind was last minute is and this again is also something in any service industry, but be aware of someone who overpromises. So you have an editor who's either promising, my personal opinion, but promising to do the developmental edits and the line edits at once to save you money. I'd be wary. But similarly, if an editor says, well, I can edit your book and it'll become an Amazon bestseller or a USA Today bestseller. Like people, if they overpromise you, it's probably not true. So, with that in mind, we will see you next time. So, thank you for listening to us.
Yay.
Thank you for joining the Otherlands Editing Podcast. Look for our next episode coming soon, and in the interim, be sure to like, share, and subscribe. Also, if you want more information or want to connect, you can find Margaret Bates and Midnight Voss at our site, Otherlands Editing. Until next time, keep writing and keep refining your words.